If Tudor historiography had its way, there would be no mystery surrounding the princes in the Tower. According to this narrative, Edward V and his brother Richard of York were murdered on behalf of their uncle Richard, who had recently seized the throne as Richard III. Allegedly, the crime was confessed to by Sir James Tyrell, the man tasked with carrying it out. However, the only source for this confession is Thomas More. Other historians, such as Polydore Virgil, also mention Tyrell as the perpetrator but offer no further details. More, it should be noted, had a flexible relationship with the truth when it suited him. His account of Richard Hune illustrates this point. Richard Hune, an innocent merchant, was imprisoned during More's time by Bishop Cuthbert Tunstall on suspicion of heresy and was subsequently murdered. More, a close friend of Tunstall, insisted it was a suicide, thus perpetuating the lies of the three churchmen accused of the murder. More's account of Richard III and the princes in the Tower is similarly riddled with inaccuracies. For example, he misstates Edward IV's age. Thus, More's reliability is highly questionable, and the well-known rule for working with historical sources applies. If one piece of information cannot be trusted, all information from that source must be scrutinized. Richard III's ardent defenders often dismiss More's work as a mere literary narrative. As theologian John Whitcomb put it, Sir Thomas More's work is nothing but one of the passing tales of the day. However, a significant problem arises for those who wish to dismiss More's account. In 1674, bones were discovered during construction work in the Tower of London. These bones, which belonged to two children of the right age, were found roughly where Tyrell's confession, according to More, had indicated they would be. Today, these remains rest in an urn in Westminster Abbey, where they are identified as those of the princes in the Tower. Doubting More's account essentially means believing in an extraordinary coincidence, a topic we will explore further in this video. Overall, however, I plan to take a different approach in evaluating Tyrell's alleged confession. I intend to investigate whether it is even possible and plausible that More had knowledge of this confession. This represents a reversal of the typical approach. While most analyses focus on the possibility that More lied, I aim to explore whether he could have been telling the truth. The key word here is could. I will not conclude that he must have been truthful. Unfortunately, I don't possess a time machine to provide definitive proof. Several attempts have been made to logically disprove the authenticity of the confession. Richard III biographer Paul Murray Kendall, for instance, argues that Henry VII would have publicized the confession immediately to quash any rumors of the prince's survival. Other authors suggest that this would have definitively proven Richard's guilt. However, logic can be a double-edged sword. One could just as logically argue that Henry VII would have drawn suspicion upon himself by publicizing the confession, especially since he continued to favor Tyrell after 1485. Moreover, 2 pardons were granted to Tyrell within a single month in 1486. Sir Clemens Markham has even speculated that Tyrell might have murdered the princes on Henry's orders between these 2 pardons. Even if Henry VII were not directly implicated, the fact that he trusted the murder of the princes for over 15 years raises questions. It's also worth noting that during this time, Edmund de la Pole was campaigning on the continent for recognition of his claim to the English crown. Tyrell supported him, which eventually led to his arrest and execution. If Henry VII had published the confession, he would have publicly acknowledged Edmund as the legitimate York heir, providing Edmund with a powerful tool to accuse Henry of murdering the princes and garnering more support. I do not wish to make a final judgment on whether this line of reasoning is stronger than Kendall's. My intention is simply to demonstrate that multiple perspectives are possible when interpreting historical actions. Therefore, it seems inappropriate to dismiss the confession outright. In preparing my analysis, I have not only consulted literature and printed sources, but have also conducted archival research. Let's begin by examining what Thomas More actually wrote. At the time of the alleged murders, Richard III was already king and travelling across his kingdom. He viewed his nephews, still imprisoned in the Tower of London, as a significant threat that needed to be eliminated. According to More, Richard first tasked Robert Brackenbury, the constable of the Tower, and a logical choice for such a task, with murdering the princes. However, Brackenbury refused, reportedly stating that he could never commit such an act. A page then supposedly recommended that Richard turn to Sir James Tyrell instead. Richard, who was at Warwick Castle at the time, hurried to Tyrell, who, according to More, had already gone to bed with his cousin Thomas. The king wanted to know if the two men were still awake. Once it was confirmed that they were, Richard allegedly commissioned Tyrell to carry out the bloody deed. Tyrell sought his cousin's assistance, but his request was denied. Richard then wrote a letter to Brackenbury instructing him to place the tower under Tyrell's control for one night and to hand over the keys. More claims that Tyrell hired two other men to assist him. Miles Forrest, supposedly one of the four remaining guards of the princes, and John Dighton, who allegedly managed Tyrell's household. More described Forrest as a fellow hardened in murder before that time, and Dighton as a big, broad, square, strong knave. According to More, the murderers entered the princes' chambers at midnight and suffocated them. Tyrell then examined the bodies and ordered them to be buried deep in the ground beneath a stairwell in the White Tower. However, Richard was reportedly dissatisfied with this burial site, believing that the sons of kings deserved better. A priest of Brackenbury then reburied the bodies in another location, but he died without revealing the new grave's location. More also mentioned that Forrest had rotted away piecemeal at St. Martin. Although More does not provide a date, there is a record from September 9th, 1484, noting an annual allowance of 5 marks for Joan Forrest, the widow of Miles Forrest, a servant of the king, to be paid from the funds of the lordship of Barnard Castle. If this Miles Forrest is indeed the same man mentioned by More, it would mean he died before September 9th. This parallel source would also confirm an important name in More's account. John Dighton was allegedly still alive when Tyrell confessed to the murder of the princes in the Tower in the spring of 1502. He was summoned for questioning and confirmed everything his former employer had testified. Unlike Tyrell, who was convicted as a traitor on May 2nd, 1502, for supporting Edmund de la Pole and executed on May 6th, Dighton was allowed to go free. We will discuss Dighton further later on, as it is undeniably strange that a confessed murderer would simply be released. Of all the things More wrote, this part of Tyrell's story seems to me the most implausible. Based on what we know, Tyrell appears to be the ideal candidate to have murdered the princes in the Tower on Richard's behalf, making him a perfect scapegoat, a point that Ricardians frequently emphasize. They are not wrong, but they often overlook the fact that Tyrell would be a logical choice for Richard to use as the prince's murderer, even without a page's suggestion. However, as I mentioned earlier, logic can be tricky. Tyrell came from a family that originally supported the Lancastrian side in the Wars of the Roses. He was the eldest son of William Tyrell of Gipping, Suffolk, who was executed on February 23, 1462, for allegedly being involved in a plot to assassinate Edward IV. From that point on, Tyrell was firmly in the Yorkist camp. He fought at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471 and was knighted by Edward IV on the battlefield. Around 1473, Tyrell likely entered the service of Richard, who was then Duke of Gloucester. There has also been speculation that he may have worked for the de la Pole, whose ancestral seat was only 10 miles from Gipping. Given his later support for Edmund de la Pole, this theory is not entirely implausible. Tyrell continued to rise through the ranks. In 1474, he was allowed to compete in a tournament organized by Edward IV to celebrate his new son Richard becoming Duke of York. In 1477, he served as Sheriff of Glamorgan and Margenweg. By April 1479, he had become Chamberlain to the future Richard III, and in 1482, Richard, then Duke of York, made him a Knight Banneret and Vice Constable of England, with Richard himself holding the position of Constable of England. Tyrell, who had 5 children with his wife Anne, continued to advance under King Richard III. He became Master of the Henchmen and was frequently involved in government commissions. I'll show some examples on the screen. He also played a crucial role in the capture of rebels during the Buckingham Rebellion, including the man himself. In 1484, Tyrell travelled to Flanders on behalf of the king. There is a recurring theory that he might have secretly taken the princes to Richard's sister, Margaret. The king eventually sent him to France as a lieutenant of Guine, where he received £3,000 in January 1485, a sum much higher than what was necessary to pay his men's salaries. Ricardians might argue that the extra funds were intended to support the princes, while those who believe more might think Tyrell's rise wasn't fast enough to satisfy him. One thing is certain. Richard did not recall Tyrell for the Battle of Bosworth, likely saving his life. As mentioned earlier, Henry VII not only pardoned Tyrell twice, but also gradually reinstated all his posts. However, Tyrell's arrest in 1502 was dramatic. Henry's agent lured Tyrell and his son Thomas out of the fortress of Guine under the false promise of safe passage, only to bring them both to the Tower. 2 years after Tyrell's execution, Parliament branded him a traitor by attainder. However, 3 years later, his son successfully had the attainder reversed. A quick note on the 2 pardons, particularly the first. In January 1486, the Archbishop of Canterbury received a letter requesting that Tyrell and several others be subpoenaed. The document, which I'll display on the screen, concerned the succession for Oxford. It's plausible that Tyrell's first pardon was related to this matter, although this cannot be stated with certainty. We know that Tyrell was in London in 1483 for Richard's coronation on July 6th and again in early September of that year. His presence at that time was related to matters concerning the royal wardrobe. However, focusing too much on Tyrell's stays in London is unnecessary when assessing More's plausibility. More explicitly, states that Richard allegedly sent Tyrell away secretly from Warwick Castle. A specific time frame is provided, as Brackenbury was supposed to hand over the tower to Tyrell for only 1 night, if More's account is accurate. More also claims that the bones of the princes were not left in their original burial site, but were moved later. If this is true, the remains should not have been found in the location where they were discovered in 1674, assuming the bones unearthed at that time were indeed those of the princes. How can this discrepancy be explained? Over time, several theories have been proposed. 1. More invented the entire story. 2. The bones were not actually relocated. Considering the distances involved, it seems unlikely that everything could have happened in a single night. Warwick Castle and the Tower of London are nearly 100 miles apart. If More's account is correct, the following sequence of events would be plausible. Tyrell returns to Richard, alone or with his accomplices, to inform the king. Richard objects to the burial site and instructs Brackenbury to relocate the bodies. To maintain secrecy, it would make sense for Tyrell to be sent again with this assignment. However, according to More, Tyrell was not present at the new burial. Only the appointed priest knew the location. This information must have been communicated to Tyrell indirectly. Therefore, if More wasn't lying, Tyrell himself was uncertain about the boy's final resting place. It was only hearsay. 3. The bones were moved and later found in the new location. The exact wording in More's account is intriguing. At the stair foot, suitably deep in the ground, under a great heap of stones. This could mean either beneath or next to the stairs. The bones discovered in 1674 were found 10 feet deep beneath the stairs, placing them near St. John's Chapel in the White Tower, a more dignified location. 4. The bodies were moved twice and eventually reburied in what was thought to be the original burial site. For those interested in the authenticity of the bones, I recommend my video on the DNA testing of the remains. Annette Carson's work is also worth considering, as she has compiled various points both for and against the bones' authenticity. 1. According to an anonymous report, purple cloth fragments were found with the bones, a color associated with royalty. 2. This wasn't the first time that bones seemingly matching the prince's remains were found. John Webb reported that in Sir Walter Raleigh's time, at the beginning of the 17th century, 2 children's skeletons had been found elsewhere, estimated to be 6 to 8 years old. 3. Carson also raises questions about the effort required for the burial. Dighton and Forrest would have had to remove a stone staircase, dig 10 feet deep, and restore everything overnight. A full construction team was needed to achieve this in 1674. Even without the stone stairs, digging to such a depth seems highly improbable without assistance. It's completely unclear how a lone priest could have accomplished such a task. 4. The location of the bones found in 1674 does not align with More's descriptions and cannot be easily reconciled with them. If these are indeed the bones of the princes, and if More was telling the truth, the third option is particularly interesting. The account that the bones were reburied by a single priest is based only on hearsay. A double reburial cannot be ruled out theoretically, but it is not something we need to delve into further at this moment. What does all this tell us about the plausibility of More's account? In principle, not much. It's possible that the bones discovered in 1674 are not the real remains of the princes, yet More may not have been lying, and the actual bones could still be hidden somewhere. It's also possible that Tyrell was not fully informed, and therefore did not relay all the details to More. The only certainty is that the 1674 bone discovery is not definitive proof that More told the truth. However, it doesn't disprove his account either. We must therefore focus on other aspects of More's work. Richard Marius, More's biographer, who seems overly admiring of the former Lord Chancellor, has made some statements worth considering. First, he assumes that the confession did take place, but that Henry simply archived it because it didn't change public opinion. People already believed Richard was guilty, so there was no need for further evidence. Personally, I find this argument as weak as the suggestion that Henry would have published the confession to settle the matter publicly once and for all. More intriguing is Marius's doubt about whether Brackenbury was even in charge of the Tower at the time of the prince's murder. Brackenbury was only appointed Constable of the Tower on July 17, 1483. If the murder occurred before that date, John Howard would have been responsible. To clarify, Brackenbury's predecessor, Thomas Grey, was Elizabeth Woodville's son from her first marriage. When events unfolded, Grey fled with his mother to the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey. Richard had appointed Howard as Lord High Steward and Earl Marshal, temporarily placing him in charge of the Tower's administration. Marius essentially argues that wherever Brackenbury is mentioned, Howard should actually be noted. He speculates that Thomas Howard, John Howard's grandson, could have been one of More's sources. The name change might have been an attempt to protect the family, which could also explain why the confession disappeared and why Tyrell wasn't allowed to speak again before his execution on May 6, 1502. Although More and Howard had close contacts, this alone is insufficient to fully support Marius's thesis. In 2021, Tim Thornton showed that More had contact with Miles Forrest's sons, who worked for Lord Chancellor Thomas Wolsey and Henry VIII. They too might have provided More with information. James Gairdner had already identified Forrest in the 19th century as one of Richard's servants who worked at Barnard Castle. I present a source that proves this contact. However, we have already established that Miles Forrest died before September 1484. If the sons had any knowledge of the events 35 years later, it must have been part of a long-standing tradition, one that could have become flawed over time. More, who wrote his historical work between 1513 and 1520 but never published it, names informants who would have had no interest in lying. Thornton suggests that this could apply to Forrest's sons. However, would they have wanted to reveal that their father murdered the uncle of the reigning king? The sons are interesting candidates when considering whether there was a confession that was later destroyed. They had access to relevant documents and possibly a vested interest in the matter, but this remains purely speculative. In 2024, Thornton also effectively countered the thesis that the Tower was a favourite residence of Henry VII. This argument arose after David Starkey demonstrated in 2015 that Henry and his wife were in the Tower at the same time as Tyrell in 1502. I also present some sources that confirm this. It's also worth mentioning a family legend of the Tyrells, published by Audrey Williamson. According to this account, Elizabeth Woodville and the princes had found refuge in the Tyrells' house. However, this has been contested, as it could only have been possible between March 1484 and August 1485, given that the former queen had been in sanctuary until then. By this time, Henry Tudor was ruling, and during this period, the queen was closely watched. Those inclined to believe the legend might point out that it doesn't specify that the mother and sons were there simultaneously. However, the effort required to secretly accommodate such high-profile figures for an extended period would have been immense. It is also clear that the Tyrell family would have had a strong interest in reshaping the narrative around their most infamous ancestor, turning him from a child murderer into something less damning. So far, I have been able to provide considerable information about Forrest and Tyrell, but relatively little about Dighton, who remains a more elusive figure. His exact identity has yet to be confirmed. According to John Harding's chronicle, Dighton was living in Calais at the time of Tyrell's confession. Other sources mention that he received a stewardship in Ayton, now Horton in Staffordshire, during Richard III's reign. There is also speculation that he could be the John Dighton who became rector of St. Nicholas Church in Fulbeck, Lincolnshire, in May 1487, during the reign of Henry VII, and held the position until 1514. The National Archives reveal a John Dighton, who was a yeoman in Henry's time, married to a woman named Margaret. It's important to note that the term yeoman was commonly used even before Henry VII's reign, referring to someone who worked as an administrator. This Dighton's apparent residence in London makes him an intriguing candidate, but his true identity remains uncertain. The crucial question is whether any of these candidates can be reconciled with the fact that Dighton allegedly confessed to murder, yet was allowed to go free, as More claimed. Thornton even speculates that Dighton himself may have been one of More's informants. In my view, the most plausible candidate would be the rector of St. Nicholas Church. As a clergyman, Dighton would have been subject to canon law, placing him beyond the reach of secular authorities. Henry VII would have needed to make the case public to compel the church to take action against Dighton, but the Tudor king apparently chose not to do so. This suggests that Dighton might have embarked on an ecclesiastical career under Henry VII for various reasons, perhaps driven by guilt over the prince's murders. If the Dighton I found in the archives is the same man, his turn to the church might also have been influenced by personal circumstances, such as the possible death of his wife. However, these remain speculations. Another possibility, though speculative, is worth mentioning briefly. There may never have been a John Dighton. More might have invented the name or altered it to make the individual unidentifiable. This aligns with Thornton's theory. Miles Forrest was long dead, so using his real name posed no risk. But if Dighton was still alive, he might have faced significant repercussions upon seeing his name linked to the murder of the princes in a prominent historical work. In this scenario, Dighton could have been a pseudonym. More's concern for protecting his sources is evident in his reluctance to name them directly, instead referring to individuals who would have had no interest in lying. It is worth noting that there are known sources for More's work, particularly Archbishop John Morton, who rose to prominence under Henry VII. More's father, John, enrolled Thomas at St. Anthony's Grammar School in London, where the young More quickly caught Morton's attention. Impressed by his talents, Morton sent Thomas to study at Oxford, at what is now Christ Church College. In More's account, the Duke of Buckingham visits Morton, apparently to gauge whether the churchman would join his rebellion. This information likely came directly to More from Morton himself, who had access to relevant documents and undoubtedly facilitated connections for Thomas during his rise as Lord Chancellor. Another key source of information was More's father, John. Thomas deeply admired his father, and according to Erasmus, he might have pursued a career in liberal studies had his father not urged him to study law. A scene in More's account of Richard III that can be directly traced back to John More involves a man named Potter, who reportedly reacted to news of King Edward IV's death by saying, "Then will my master the Duke of Gloucester be king." In the Latin version of More's work, he adds a statement, modernized and translated as, "I remember this conversation was reported to my father by a man who had heard them conversing, well before there was any suspicion of treachery." In the English text, More simply says, however, "This have I by credible information learned." The second version is stronger, emphasizing credible information over mere hearsay. This difference highlights some of the challenges in assessing More's credibility, but it underscores the possibility that his account could be true. John More himself is a particularly interesting figure. Born in the mid-15th century as the son of a baker, he studied law and became a member of Lincoln's Inn Bar Association around 1470 or 1475. Although little is known about him until the turn of the century, he married Agnes Granger, Thomas's mother, in 1474 and went on to marry 3 more times, each time to wealthy widows. Under Edward IV, John More was granted the right to bear his own coat of arms, indicating deliberate promotion by the Yorkist king, though this connection remains somewhat speculative. Beyond the birth of his children, little else is known about John More during the 15th century, but he must have achieved considerable prominence as a lawyer. In the 16th century, John More's career advanced significantly. He rose through the ranks of various courts and became a Justice of the King's Bench around 1520. Prior to this, he worked in the administration of London, overseeing the maintenance and expansion of the London Bridge. At Lincoln's Inn, he became Master of the Revels, a prestigious position that Thomas More himself later held, even while serving as Lord Chancellor of England. It is worth noting that John More held a dim view of women, whom he saw as foolish creatures, a sentiment he passed on to Thomas. Despite this, Thomas originally aspired to the priesthood, but abandoned the idea due to his physical desires. This makes his later close relationship with his daughter Margaret all the more remarkable. Her husband, William, wrote the first biography of Thomas, and Margaret herself preserved many of his works. John More lived until 1530, with Thomas surviving him by only a few years. It is evident that John More's anecdotes influenced Thomas's account of Richard III, and likely the Potter anecdote was not the only one. As a judge, John More had access to numerous documents, and although he was only part of the King's Bench after Thomas had stopped working on his history of Richard, he undoubtedly had many important contacts. Particularly noteworthy is that John More became a Justice of Assize in 1513. This court, which dealt with serious crimes that could result in the death penalty, existed until 1971. If James Tyrell had confessed, such a confession would likely have been archived by this court, and John More could have accessed it. This is speculation, but it is possible that Thomas heard about the Tyrell confession from his father. Thomas began working on the history of Richard around the time, and ended around the time his father became Justice of the Common Pleas in 1518. Given his admiration for his father and his father's position as a judge, Thomas likely believed John had no reason to be untruthful. Therefore, I surmise that the information surrounding Tyrell's confession could have come from John More, who had the necessary access. Before I present my verdict, I would like to address the doubts and contradictions that surround Tyrell's possible confession and the account provided by More. 1. Torture and credibility. If there was indeed a confession, it was probably obtained under torture. This significantly undermines its credibility and warrants a critical assessment. 2. Fabricated confession. It is plausible that Tyrell fabricated the confession as a strategic move, perhaps to secure a promise to protect his son or to avoid a traitor's death. Both outcomes did occur. 3. Reversed conviction. Tyrell's conviction for high treason was later reversed. Given his undeniable support for Edmund de la Pole, this reversal is surprising and raises further questions. 4. Pardons of 1486. The issuance of 2 pardons within a single month in 1486 is particularly noteworthy and unusual. 5. Anomalies in pardons. Other irregularities concerning pardons cannot be easily reconciled with Tyrell's situation. For example, Ralph Hastings, the brother of William Hastings, who had been executed by Richard for treason, was confirmed as guardian of the lions and leopards in the Tower of London in early August 1483. Just 8 days later, Richard III issued a general pardon for Hastings. What transpired during those 8 days is unclear, but it is noteworthy that in the context of this pardon, Hastings's role as lieutenant of the Castle of Guynes is emphasized, an important position for Tyrell as well. Additionally, Hastings was present at Richard's coronation. 6. Delayed confession. If Tyrell confessed, he would have kept it secret for nearly 19 years. This raises the question of whether he might have confided in someone else at some point. One likely candidate would be de la Pole, whom Tyrell supported. However, there is no evidence that Tyrell shared this knowledge with anyone. 7. Richard's page. More writes that a page supposedly gave Richard the idea to hire Tyrell, But why would the king risk involving a page in such a sensitive matter, especially one as significant as the murder of his nephews? 8. More's unpublished work. Another point of contention is why More never published his work. There is speculation that he may have waited until all those involved had died, but there is no concrete evidence to support this. The fact that the first version was published after More's death, during the reign of Henry VIII, suggests that the king himself had no objections to its release. These points illustrate the complexities and uncertainties surrounding Tyrell's alleged confession and More's account, which must be carefully weighed in any final judgment. There are significant doubts surrounding Tyrell's confession as presented by More. Many aspects of the account raise skepticism. For example, More asks us to trust or perhaps imagine that the confession document was destroyed and is therefore irretrievable. The confession itself, as it is described, lacks the plausibility we would hope for, particularly concerning the two alleged accomplices. Forrest had been dead for some time, and Dighton cannot be definitively identified. These factors conveniently prevent verification of whether the events occurred as More depicts them. However, some points lend credibility to the confession. Notably, More named Miles Forrest, who indeed served Richard and whose widow received a financial donation, which is a significant detail. Additionally, the fact that the king, queen, and Tyrell were all in the Tower of London during the relevant time period is also noteworthy. Moreover, More had the necessary connections to access such information. In conclusion, while it is possible that the confession occurred as described, it is not particularly likely. This leads us to question how we should interpret and use this information, a topic we will discuss next week. For today, the following applies. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to support my channel.